Welcome to my very first long video on mortgage. So I wanted to create some content here for you guys where people that really wanted to dive in on some specific problems and products and projects within the mortgage industry could kind of get in the weeds with me a little bit and really try to understand what it is that mortgage lenders see, what our guidelines say that we've got to do, and comprehend what it is that mortgage lenders are requiring of our borrowers in specific situations. So I've started compiling a list of exactly what topics we need to cover that I think are really relevant to realtors, builders, buyers, and other finance industry professionals that might be sending clients or become a client themselves within the mortgage industry. So my first topic that we're going to cover today is bankruptcy, and we're only going to cover the two most common types of bankruptcy that we see as mortgage originators. This is going to be Chapter 13 and Chapter 7. Those two forms of bankruptcies is what we're going to cover today. So if you've had questions about that, how that impacts your ability to buy a home, how that impacts your ability to get financing, what the heck those types of bankruptcy are, and how that can impact you, you're in the right place, because that's what we're covering today. I have 3 pages worth of notes in my handy dandy little notebook here that I'm gonna refer back to just to make sure that I'm giving you guys the most accurate information as of today. And keep in mind, mortgage guidelines are fluid. They change from time to time, but I've been doing this about a decade now, and bankruptcy has pretty much remained the same as far as what our requirements are when we're documenting a loan for a borrower who's been through a bankruptcy in the past 7 years. So if you are a potential borrower, have potential clients who want to borrow money that have exceeded that 7-year history of a bankruptcy that's longer than that, that's really not going to be an item of concern for us. We are only concerned about bankruptcies that have taken place in the 7 years prior to our loan application, okay? And that's regardless of loan type, okay? So I'm also going to look at this from the scope of conventional loans and FHA loans, because those are the two most popular types of financing that we see in the mortgage industry. So we're going to cover both Chapter 13 and Chapter 7 bankruptcy on this. So let's start with, what are the main differences? What is the difference between a Chapter 7 and a Chapter 13 bankruptcy? And there is a big difference here. I will tell you that from what we see on our side, Chapter 13 is more common. And the reason for that is because it's not really a forgiveness of debt. It is more of a restructuring of debt where borrowers have to abide by a court-appointed repayment plan. Okay, so you're gonna just reconstruct your payments, make payments through court-ordered plan. You get to keep all of your assets this way. So that's really beneficial for a lot of borrowers. It also means that you're going to be able to qualify for a mortgage earlier than you would with Chapter 7, and I'm going to get into that here in just a little bit as well. But Chapter 13 is really a reorganization plan, and so this is where the courts are going to analyze your debt and look at your property also and your assets and see, okay, based on all of this information, here's how much money you need to plan to repay. So with that in mind, it's court-ordered repayment plan. The repayment plan typically takes 3 to 5 years to complete. So you're being addressed by the court for 3 to 5 years as you're making your repayments to get out from under the debts that you're currently liable for. Another thing I want to back up and say is that there are certain obligations that you have that cannot be dismissed through a bankruptcy, and that's going to include tax debt. So think federal, state liens that you might have for back taxes. You're going to have to pay those regardless of whether or not you file bankruptcy. Mortgages. If you don't want them to take your house, your mortgages you're still going to be on the hook for that. Okay. Foreclosure, which is where you just give your house back to the bank and walk away from your payments. That's a totally different issue. I'll cover that some other time. Child support and alimony. You don't get to get out from underneath that just because you file bankruptcy. And then student loans, and especially here I'm going to cover federal student loans. You cannot walk away from those just because you file bankruptcy, okay, regardless of the bankruptcy type that you file. So that's kind of one of the high points on Chapter 13. The other part being Chapter 7, which is a dissolution of debt, where you're walking away from things like, think here, unsecured debt as far as personal loans and credit card bills, medical debt, all of that. Once you file for bankruptcy, those creditors have to cease and desist while you're going through that bankruptcy process. So it's really going to eliminate debt. Now, again, it will not help you get out from underneath late mortgage payments, and it will not help you get out from underneath your car payments if you don't want those properties also repossessed. So you are protected with certain assets. So your home and your vehicle are usually, and I'm saying usually, protected assets that you get to keep. Now, it does lengthen the period of time that you have to get those things caught up, all right? And I'm not going to dive too far into that. I'm not an attorney, so I would recommend you go talk to a bankruptcy attorney if this is something where you find yourself in this situation. But they're going to look at all of your non-exempt debt for Chapter 7, and you're going to have to sell that off effectively to pay off your creditors, whatever the value of that non-exempt assets are. Okay, so if you own additional property that isn't homesteaded, or if you've got, you know, investment accounts and things like that that can be dissolved, they're going to take hold of those assets to dissolve them to pay back your creditors, and you get to walk away. So the Chapter 7 bankruptcy is a much shorter process. Instead of 3 to 5 years, which is where you're looking at for a Chapter 13 bankruptcy, where you're restructuring payments, you're going to get to walk away clean on a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, which means 3 to 5 months, as far as, you know, once a court date is set and all of that is determined by the courts. Okay, now very few people qualify for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, and this is why we tend to see on the mortgage side of things more common that we see Chapter 13. Okay, Chapter 13 is not allowed for businesses, so typically we see corporate bankruptcies going through a different form of bankruptcy, not Chapter 13. All right, but Chapter 7, you've got to pass income limitations. There are income limitations set by each state, and you have to fall below that median income limit. And if you don't, there's also a means test that they can look at for you that really analyzes your income, family size, and other expenses that you can't get out from underneath. All right, so they're going to analyze all of that and determine based on that if you qualify for Chapter 7. And if you don't, then they're going to look at Chapter 13 for you. All right, so you've got a client, or you are a client who has previously been through one of these bankruptcy types. How does this affect you when you're trying to get a mortgage with us? So all mortgage companies have to follow the same standard at a baseline, the same standard requirements if they're selling a loan on the secondary market, which is, think FHA and standard conventional loans where there's investors backing them. If we're not meeting those requirements, we're looking at what we call, a lot of people refer to it as subprime. I don't really like that term. That makes me feel really icky, but we would call that non-qualified mortgage or non-QM mortgage products. And so there are specialty investors out there for that. I'm not discussing any of that today. I'm looking at just secondary market loans, so standard conventional and FHA loans, and as far as what those requirements are. So kind of like I mentioned earlier, if you file Chapter 13 bankruptcy, you can get into a mortgage loan much quicker than if you file Chapter 7. And that's because you're really making a good faith effort to get your debts repaid within your ability to do that. So with a conventional loan, for instance, for Chapter 13, if it's discharged, meaning you met your obligations and you fulfilled the requirements of the bankruptcy court, there's a 2-year waiting period. If your bankruptcy was dismissed, meaning for some reason you failed to make all of the payments or had to walk away from that situation, it was never resolved. Once it's dismissed, you have to wait 4 years before we can do a conventional loan for you. Okay, so this is based on conventional financing. FHA sees a Chapter 13 bankruptcy as a 2-year commitment. So you have to have been discharged for 2 years before we can do a mortgage loan for you in that situation. Chapter 7 is similar for FHA. FHA doesn't distinguish between Chapter 7 and 13. It's a 2-year wait regardless. On Chapter 7, though, for conventional loans, it's a 4-year wait. And again, that's because you're walking away from debt. So those borrowers that have walked away from debt are a higher risk to investors that are looking at giving them a long-term loan. So if you're looking at a 10, 15, 30-year mortgage, that's something that we have to take into account as far as our risk threshold with you as a customer. So again, we kind of got in the weeds on this a little bit, and I hope that you find this kind of stuff useful, because a lot of customers have questions on bankruptcy in general and how does that affect me. Obviously, I'm never going to advise someone to file bankruptcy if it's absolutely not needed. I'm first going to refer you to a credit counselor, credit repair company. We've got contacts with those kinds of people. We also have contacts with attorneys if it really does come down to that. But I'm always gonna say that bankruptcy is a last resort, just because it does take so long to get through the process. And then also, once you have gone through the process, to reestablish your credit, where you're credit worthy enough to be able to purchase a home later. So if you've got further questions about this, or want to discuss bankruptcy on a deeper level, kind of go through some of these guidelines so that you can see really what each investor is requiring as far as their requirements go, I'm happy to look at that with you. And if you've got other topics you want me to cover and really kind of dive into them so that you can see what options are out there based on, perhaps foreclosures and short sales and things like that, I'm happy to do videos on those too, so that you guys can see really how that impacts you. So hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And if y'all need anything mortgage related, have questions, comments, or concerns, I'm here for you.